Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we should get started because the schedule is very tight, and we have 1 hour for this keynote speech. So it is my honor and my pleasure to be presenting today our first keynote speaker, Professor Eulalia Piñero, whom we all know as Lali, and that's what she likes to be called. But before introducing her, I want to begin by reading from this very nice mug we have been given, the quote that appears here, because a conference entitled Wastelands should begin by quoting Eliot before anything else. So, if there were water and no rock, if there were rock and also water, and water a spring, a pool among the rock, if there were the sound of water only. So let's hope we can only hear water during these 3 days. I want to begin also by thanking the UNED and particularly Professor Cristina Garrigos, our dear friend, for having asked me to present Lali today. Nothing could make me happier than to introduce Professor Lali Piñero. She's a very dear friend from years and years ago. The reason why I have been asked to present her is because I am Isabel Duran, by the way. I'm a professor of American literature at the Complutense University, which is next door. Because I was the former president of EAAS, the Spanish Association for American Studies, and between 2015 and 2019, and Lali, Professor Piñero, took over as the president of EAAS, and she has been doing a wonderful job since. So she's our president, and I'm so fond and so happy and so proud of introducing her today. Eulalia Piñero Gil is an associate professor of American literature and gender studies at the Universidad Autónoma of Madrid. Currently, as I just said, she's the president of the Spanish Association for American Studies, EAAS, and director of the Madrid Master's Degree in English Studies at the UAM at her university. She's very well known in EAAS because she has served as a member She has been a board member of both associations. She has taught at many universities here and abroad, among them Purdue University, St. Louis University, UNED, this university. She has also taught here, University Complutense of Madrid, mine, and University of Castilla-La Mancha. So she's been all over. She was awarded a full scholarship to study comparative and American literature at Purdue University in Indiana, where she graduated with a master's degree. Likewise, she was awarded a doctoral grant to research the archive of the American modernist poet Marianne Moore, on whom she is an expert, at the Rosenbach Library and Foundation in Philadelphia, and 2 postgraduate scholarships by the Canadian government to research Canadian and American women's poetry at Toronto University. She has published extensively, very extensively, on American Renaissance, modernism, women's literature, and comparative literature. Notably, she has co-edited a number of important books, including Visions of Canada Approaching the Millennium, 1999, Voices and Images of Women in 20th Century Theater, Anglo-American Women Playwrights in 2002, Women and Art, Visions of Change and Social Development in 2010, Breaking a Sea of Silence, Interdisciplinary Reflections on Gender Violence, 2013, and Life Deep and Suck All the Marrow of Life, H.G. Thoreau's Literary Legacy in 2020. She is also the author of the critical edition of Extraordinary Narrations by Edgar Allan Poe, 1999, and the translation and critical edition of Herman Melville's Battle by the Scrivener in 2006. In 2012, she translated into Spanish and edited Kate Chopin's The Awakening, and in 2020, Kate Chopin's complete short stories. She was the first translator of Kate Chopin's short stories into Spanish. And her text is one that I always use and recommend my students when I teach The Awakening, which I only did like 2 weeks ago. Because of all of this, because her contribution to Chopin studies, she has been appointed a member of the Kate Chopin International Society Advisory Committee for her contribution to this American writer. In 2018, she translated and edited for the first time in Spanish John dos Passos, A Push Cart at the Curb, Invierno en Castilla. So as you can see, she has a very extensive and broad list of merits, academic merits. Moreover, she's a dedicated teacher, enthusiastic president of an association, and a very, very dear friend. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Eulalia Piñero, Lali, and the title of her lecture is From the Wasteland to the Arcadia, John dos Passos' Transcultural and Transliterary Journey to Spain. Thank you, Lali.
Well, first of all, I think that I'm going to unmask myself, if I am allowed. Well, I imagine that you all have a great joy today of being here together, of meeting our colleagues and dear friends for the first time in 2 years. At least this is my first time. So I feel really, really honored, happy, and thrilled to be here today. Thank you so much, Isabel, for your generous words. Thank you, Cristina Garrigós, Antonio Ballesteros, and the entire organizing committee for your hard work and for the success. I imagine it's going to be a very, very, very successful conference, no? Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak today at the European Association for American Studies Biennial Conference. It's a great honor. Long time, I was a member of the EAAS board, and I have great, great memories of that time. We are celebrating the centenary of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, a long poem central to American modernism, in which Eliot poses, among many other topics, the search for meaning in what he sees as a fragmented and a spiritually desolate modern world after the devastating aftermath of World War I and the deadliest flu pandemic of 1918. Oops, okay. In this long poem, the reader experiences a deep sense of loss and despair characteristic of the modern world. Today, in similar historical circumstances, unfortunately, I would like to celebrate in my lecture the centenary of John dos Passos' books, Rocinante to the Road Again, and A Pushcart at the Curb, published in 1922. Both texts were inspired by his journeys in Spain and other European countries and his experience in World War I. In my view, these American writers suffered the same disillusion and outrage and gave voice to a lost generation shaken by war and illness. I would also like to explore in my lecture how John dos Passos represents his temporary expatriate condition as an American with Iberian roots, and how he expressed his need for an idealized Arcadia far from the war and the excesses of American industrialization, monetarism, and materialism. Dos Passos explores in Rocinante to the road again. By the way, Rocinante is the name of Don Quixote's horse, and a kind of doppelganger, animal doppelganger. So in Rocinante, Dos Passos explores his own transcultural identity through the return to what I call quixotic Arcadia. In his transliterary quest for what he called the Spanish gesture, Dos Passos was also searching how to define his own unstable hybrid modernist identity in the context of Spanish society. Most scholars have observed that Dos Passos showed a utopian commitment to ideological radicalism in his early literary aesthetics and in his historical and political views of American Europe during his youth. In this regard, scholar Young Lee draws attention to the fact that, quote, as a modernist, he tried to connect his aesthetic creativity to the totality of history in a dialectical way. Since the perspective of totality is the core of his political radicalism, as well as his art. In his quest for the totality of history, young Dos Passos needed to internationalize his experience and creativity to connect them to the historical context, much like other modernists who express in their artistic creations a deep sense of loss and despair for their society. This was the case of many American expatriate writers, namely T.S. Eliot, Gertrude Stein, Scott Fitzgerald, and Ezra Pound. They sought to internationalize their literature, and they lived in European urban centers such as London and Paris to show their disillusion and despair with the materialist ideas of human progress and the invisible role and place of the artist in contemporary life. In my view, distance became a metaphor of their alienation, and the urge to convey a dissenter perspective was a crucial aspect of the modernist poetics. Therefore, crossing cultural and ideological frontiers was at the core of their artistic experience. Dos Passos' journey to Spain in 1916 inspired the travel book Rocinante to the Road Again, which is a series of narrative chapters and essays on his experiences in the villages and cities, and an insightful literary analysis of a Spanish writer such as, of course, Miguel de Cervantes, Jorge Manrique, Joan Maragall, Juan Ramón Jiménez, and Antonio Machado, among others. In Rocinante, Dos Passos puts Madrid and all the Spanish cities on the map of the global scope of modernism in his quest for the modernist cosmopolitan subject, and initiated at the same time a very fruitful transatlantic dialogue between American and Spanish literatures. For this purpose, he wrote an innovative modernist epic in which his fictional heroes, Telemachus and Aeneas, are searching for the transcendental and abstract totality of life. Concretely, their quest focuses on what he calls the Spanish gesture in a historical period of modernization and deep social transformation. Dos Passos' holistic approach, which can be found in many of the colorful sections of the travel book, shows his experimentation and intense interaction with prose, poetry, and painterly descriptive techniques. Such experimentation illustrates the author's relevant involvement with modernist poetics in his groundbreaking and, as Jameson says, discontinuous literary cross-cutting. In this sense, Ezra Pound's famous avant-garde exhortation, "Make it new," is clearly reflected in the rhetorical techniques employed in Rocinante. As an experimental travel book that departs from the classical linear descriptions of these kind of texts, it fictionalizes the protagonists and uses discontinuous and fragmentary narrative structures. Thus, Dos Passos' fictional alter ego, Telemachus, becomes a wanderer in search of a father and an epic hero who undergoes an initiation journey of transformation and spiritual awakening in the Spanish society. For this reason, the author structures his interpretation of contemporary Spain on the parallel mythic pairs, as I mentioned earlier, of Telemachus and Aeneas, and of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. By the way, panza in Spanish means belly. Quote, Telemachus and Quixote constitute the life of the intellect and spirit, like Eos and Pantha, that of the body and the senses, as Spicer has observed. In this way, Don Quixote of La Mancha, Spain's most famous epic narrative, offered the American writer the opportunity to reevaluate the complex meanings of the wandering hero from La Mancha and his esquire, and through these two figures, to evaluate the progress and benefits of modernity. In Rocinante, Dos Passos explores the implicit dialectical interaction between creativity and the totality of history, the role of the modernist utopian illusion and the quest for the return to an Edenic past, and the cosmopolitan expatriate individual in the Spanish historical context of the first decades of the 20th century. The experimental fragmentary form of Rocinante is deeply engaged with a specific historical situation, and Dos Passos poses his aesthetic, political, and literary ideas from a comparative perspective in a fruitful translinguistic and transcultural literary dialogue between the United States and Spain. Likewise, the Spanish idealized vision depicted in Rocinante becomes a symbol of Dos Passos' quest for a return to the mythic Arcadia, and a counter-image to a world destroyed by its devotion to the false gods of modernity, previously depicted in his anti-war novel, Three Soldiers, 1921. But it also provides compensation for the loss of his homeland, a quest for transformation and the eradication of the money-making culture that he clearly rejected. In this slide, Frederick Jameson emphasized the role of purification that most modernist fiction had in an attempt to separate literature from the dissatisfaction and disillusionment of the existing capitalist order, so that it could embody, quote, the great utopian idea of a purification of language, a recreation of its deeper communal or collective function, a purging of everything instrumental or commercial in it. Similarly, it is my contention that Rocinante represents the Jamesonian, as I said earlier, quest for purification, and it might be explored as the symbol of Dos Passos' utopian illusion about an ideal future, in contrast to the despair and disillusion that he represents in all of his major novels, like, for instance, in Manhattan Transfer, 1925, or in the previously mentioned Three Soldiers. As a result, the Spain depicted in Rocinante symbolized for the writer the original fullness and the true gods of the past still potent. Nevertheless, as the writer evolved in his literary career, a deep change was depicted in his fiction, a clear image, quote, of the disintegration of America symbolized by his concept, the two nations in a dialectical tension with his utopian vision of one community where people live together in harmony and are allowed to have their own opportunities of self-realization, as Lee has observed. I have entitled this section of my lecture, Chronicling Spain, 1916 and Chronicling World War I. Dos Passos discovered Spain in 1916, as I mentioned earlier, when he was a young man full of illusions and expectations about the old world. In those years, he wrote, traveled, read, and chronicled his wanderings. His journey to Southern Europe also included his painful experience in France as a volunteer ambulance driver during World War I. This was in 1917. The writer's anti-war views and emotional crisis emerged rapidly in the form of writing, and he fictionalized his disappointment in Three Soldiers and in many of the poems of A Pushcart at the Curb, where his lyrical voice emerges openly with a desperate tone to save the world from the deceptions of the great warlords. This is my edition of John Dos Passos' complete poetry. Is a bilingual edition, and it includes the longest part of his poetry collection, which is Invierno en Castilla. That's why we entitled it in Spanish, Invierno en Castilla, instead of A Pushcart at the Curb, which sounds really weird, at least in Spanish. So I'm going to read from one of his poems war poems, which I consider very revealing. In his poem, Palinode of Victory, a palinode is a note in which a poet retracts something he has said in a previous poem. The young poet describes the manipulation of soldiers and the gruesome reality of battle. I'm reading just 2 stanzas from this poem because it's a very long one, but I think that the 2 stanzas I have chosen are very significant to see his approach and his pain and his disillusion about the war. All is free to soldiers, to the weary heroes who have bled and soaked the whole earth in their sacrificial blood, who have in their bare flesh clogged the crazy wheels of Juggernaut. Free the peoples from the dragon that devoured them, that scorch with greed their pleasant fields and villages, their quiet, delightful places. So they of the frock coats amid wreaths and flags victorious, to the crowds in the flaring squares and murmurous applause, rises like smoke to mingle in the sky with the crashing of the bells. Well, this is the end of the 2 stanzas I have chosen. In this poem, like in 3 Soldiers, Dos Passos depicts how the military system and the war didn't care about the soldiers except as integers in a system. Ludington has pointed out that the idea that systems molded humans obsessed the American writer. And this is true, as in most poems about the war, Dos Passos focuses on how soldiers were entrapped and manipulated by political propaganda and the dehumanizing effect of the military. In a letter to his friend Ramsey Marvin, he speaks out about his own experience as an ambulance rider. Quote, "The war is utter damn nonsense, a vast cancer fed by lies and self-seeking malignity on the part of those who don't do the fighting. None of the poor devils whose mangled, dirty bodies I take to the hospital in my ambulance really give a damn about any of the aims of this ridiculous affair." This sounds familiar today, no? We have seen the images of the war in Ukraine. In 3 Soldiers, he also alludes to the 1918 flu pandemic, and it seems that he also contracted it on a troop ship in November 1918. I have also chosen this very brief quotation from this wonderful novel. I highly recommend it to you. Is fascinating because the 3 Soldiers in which he focuses his fiction are inspired by different visions about the war. Andrews, for instance, is John Dos Passos' alter ego. He's a musician, a pianist, who eventually is a hero, a kind of anti-hero, because he becomes a deserter. No, Andrews reveals in this novel the horrors of war. And I just wanted to quote briefly this conversation they have. Andrews has a conversation with a soldier about the flu to see the impact of the flu that we have experienced also during these last 2 years, the impact it had in 1918. So what's he doing now? Asked Andrews. He died on the transport coming across here. He died of the flu. I met a fella came over in his regiment. They dropped him overboard when they were inside of the Azores. Well, I didn't die of the flu. Have another bot? No, thanks, said Andrews. Dos Passos' disappointment with the contradictions of the American economic system, the sense of social uprooting, and the war experience unchained his need to search for an alternative vital experience. In this manner, his discovery of Spain became a sort of positive personal catharsis in a crucial period. Even though his first stay was less than 4 months, he had learned a great deal, not only about Spain, but also about himself. Similarly, the Spanish experience played a central role in Dos Passos' development of his cosmopolitanism as a writer. And it was the most important factor among many in shaping Dos Passos' ideas and forming the way he saw the world. Hence, for the writer, the Iberian Peninsula was, in spite of the social conflicts and injustices he observed, an Arcadian or idyllic society compared to the industrialized European and American countries. It was a place of rustic innocence and idyllically pastoral. Rocinante consists of 17 essays and narrative segments. Dos Passos wrote in a fragmentary form with a recurring leitmotif of the journey as a quest of discovery. For Piñero, the text, quote, is a significant expression of what can be called the modernistic expatriate imagination. The travel book opens in Madrid, which was one of Dos Passos' favorite cities, with a vivid reference to one of Plaza Santa Ana's cafes. Quote, he sat on a yellow plush bench in the Café El Oro del Rin, Plaza Santa Ana, Madrid, swabbing up with a bit of bread the last smudges of brown sauce of a plate of which the edges were piled with a dismembered skeleton of a pigeon. It seems that people ate pigeons at the turn of the century. Well, each of the 17 sections of this fragmented travel book is a detailed impressionistic word painting of Spanish society, culture, ideology, art, history, and literature. In my view, Dos Passos' fragmented style is related to the complexity of Spanish culture and society, as well to his desire to represent the valuable information he gathered during his intense journeys. One of his most distinctive rhetorical strategies was the direct interaction with ordinary people he met on the road and in the village and cities. In fact, the book has 5 sections titled Talk by the Road, wherein the author uses an interactive dialogical structure with a polyphonic interplay of various characters, voices, which contributes to a fruitful exchange of ideas. Those conversations were essential materials that show his interest in how Spaniards lived in a particular historical moment as political subjects and how they expressed themselves about it. As a result, even though he had a very idealized image of a Spanish social reality, he was also interested in investigating the Spaniards' response to the political situation and the social unrest as part of a larger structure of a historical situation. In analyzing Spain's social and political tensions during the first decades of the 20th century, Dos Passos explores the complex layers of Spanish history and the social influence of the different civilizations. He concludes that Spain's palimpsestic history was an alternative to the capitalist dissolution of history. In one of the many conversations he has in Rocinante about the multicultural heritage of Spanish culture, one of his friends observes, quote, Spain, he said, is the most civilized country in Europe. The growth of our civilization has never been interrupted by outside influence. The Phoenicians, the Romans, Spain's influence on Rome was, I imagine, fully as great as Rome's on Spain. I think of the Spanish emperors, of the 5 Spanish emperors. The Goths, the Moors, all incidents absorbed by the changeless Iberian spirit. Rocinante is Dos Passos' first publication of European reportage that clearly had ideological implications about his cosmopolitan identity as an American modernist writer and intellectual. But paradoxically, this personal analysis had to be achieved abroad during those years in which he was on the road and immersed in a deep cultural exploration in the lands of Castile, La Mancha, Madrid, Andalusia, Toledo, and the Mediterranean coast. The exotic Spain was for the writer the perfect place for this transformation, a kind of peaceful refuge in which he could reflect on his own country from a distance with the necessary detachment to be really critical about his complex American identity. Similarly, it was the social milieu where he found the raw material from which he crafted his experimental fiction. In this sketchy narrative, he's seeking understanding of himself through self-exile. Moreover, it is an intriguing self-exploration through which he discovers what he considers a positive value system in Spanish culture and life that contrasts with the materialism and moral narrowness of American life. In fact, Spain was a kind of island apart from the Europe he had previously known. And he enjoyed the relaxed lifestyle, the quality food, the musical sounds, and the cities and villages, the importance of culture and tradition, and the slow pace of life. Historian Daniel Aron has observed that Spanish social and cultural idiosyncrasies had a greater impact in Dos Passos' imagination. Quote, Dos Passos' ancestral roots in Portugal were next door to Spain, whose greatest literary works, such as Don Quixote, had a tremendous effect on him, as did the nation itself. With its proud history, its varied, striking landscape, and its natural traits of an almost anarchistic individualism and a notable, if not always successful, defiance of oppressive authority. End of quote. I certainly agree with Aaron's view, for in Rocinante, Dos Passos not only tested his beliefs about the kind of individualism he was looking for in America, but it was also a radical way of approaching life and politics, which was far beyond the limits of capitalist society. The epic journey he initiated in Spain became a sort of quest for the promised land in which he discovered a colorful society full of positive aspects in a colorless world. However, the writer also shows that his travel book is deeply engaged with a concrete historical reality, such as the social unrest derived from the high prices and the descent of wages those years. That period of economic instability was a major source of social discontent, and the labor unions demanded wage increases in the 24-hour general strike of December 1916. In addition, World War I helped to produce a social crisis, almost as great in Spain and in some of the belligerent countries. The most important social tensions within Spanish life were, according to Stanley Payne, the historian, quote, the clash of religious and political ideologies, the atmosphere of publicized violence during the war years, and finally, the revolutionary upheavals of Eastern and Central Europe between 1917 and 1919. At the same time, Dos Passos' political insight was admirable. His remarkable analysis of how centralism was one of the key political debates of the Spanish society in the 1920s, as it is today, I'm afraid, is prescient. Spain, quote, as a modern centralized nation is an illusion, a very unfortunate one. For the present atrophy, the desolating restlessness of a century of revolution may be very well be due in large measure to the artificial imposition of centralized government on a land essentially centrifugal. As we have seen, Dos Passos was aware of the social and political tensions of the first decades of the 20th century and how Spain was polarized between those who were in favor of modernizing processes and those who resisted it. Among the former group were workers, middle classes in towns and cities, liberal intellectuals, and among the latter group were those counter-revolutionaries who firmly believed that the most significant features of the Spanish nation were Catholicism, monarchy, armed forces, and empire. Dos Passos unmistakably decried the inaction of those politicians who were more concerned about centralizing power and who found in repression the only response of the social unrest. He instead favored politicians who looked toward modernization and social and political reforms. However, those demands were heavily contested by the most conservative classes of society. But in spite of the political and social crisis, he was able to portray in his historical chronicle the positive aspects of the Spanish gesture and the strength and the weakness of Spain, the easy acceptance of life, the unashamed joy in food and color, and the strong anarchistic reliance on the individual man. At the same time, he emphasizes the rich diversity of a complex nation in trying to hammer some sort of unified impression out of the scattered pictures of Spain in my mind. One of the things I realize is that there are many Spains. Don Quixote as alter ego. With regard to Dos Passos' decision to articulate his Spanish experience with Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote in mind, it seems that the novel was for the writer the perfect representation of the literary archetype of the dreamer and the motif of the epic journey that crosses cultural frontiers. In fact, he was fascinated with the novel and read it more than 9 times, the last time in Spanish. Besides, he also intended to study it in depth because he believed that among many other things, it represented the palimpsestic Spanish history. And that significant aspect would help him establish the connections between both cultures. In this sense, it is important to draw attention to the fact that Dos Passos belongs to a remarkable tradition of American writers who have established an intertextual dialogue between their fiction and Don Quixote de la Mancha, spanning from the American Renaissance to postmodern literature. Among them, I would like to highlight the following writers: Washington Irving, William Dean Howells, Mark Twain, Herman Melville, Eudora Welty, William Faulkner, John Steinbeck, Jack Kerouac, and Paul Auster, among others. Likewise, Dos Passos' alter ego shows his attraction to Don Quixote because the wanderer here embarks on an idealist journey of self-discovery that embodies an indestructible chimera that is grounded in a quest for a new utopian dream of human regeneration. In Rocinante, he writes, "Gentlemen, it is a little ridiculous to say so, for we have set out once more with lance and helmet of knight errantry to free the enslaved, to right the wrongs of the oppressed." As we have seen, Dos Passos showed a striking nostalgia for a golden age during his youth and supposedly was based on a primordial social harmony in which people could survive without the constraints of a materialist society. He struggled between the old and the new and the loss of innocence and his early literature in what could be described as a quixotic attitude. In this sense, he also identified the fictional's character idealism with what he defines as one of the most extraordinary virtues of the Spanish people. The Spaniard, like his own Don Quixote, mounted the war horse on his idealism and set out to free the oppressed alone. His journey into the heart of the Spanish landscape, culture, and its peoples was embedded in a utopian illusion that foregrounded the interaction between creativity, history, and the role of purification of literature. With this ideological background, the impact of Dos Passos' Spanish experience was so deep that he had to share his discovery with his friends and colleagues. Dudley Poor, one of his many American college friends, when he was about to return to Madrid, he wrote him a letter and he says, "I am mad about Spain, the wonderful mellowness of life, the dignity, the layered ages." From a rhetorical perspective, Rocinante, like his poetry collection, A Pushcart at the Curb or Winter in Castile, shows an impressive emphasis on visual imagery. According to his grandson, John Dos Passos Coggin, the writer always had the eye of a painter and the ear of a poet. In particular, the author was aware of the importance of verbally representing the perceptual information in the absence of visual input. In other words, it seems as if Dos Passos really had a deep need to paint the Spanish images he was describing visually throughout the different sections of Rocinante. In fact, he also left a visual testimony of his sensorial perception of the Spanish landscapes in the form of a series of colorful watercolors and canvases, as he was also an accomplished painter who created over 400 artworks during his lifetime. This is the volume that collects all of his painting and canvases and drawings. Dos Passos absorbed from the avant-garde painters of his time elements of Impressionism, Expressionism, and Cubism. The extreme modernity of his early watercolors from the countryside of Spain shows how he opted to combine elements from different styles and textures. There are many relevant examples of his sensorial way of depicting the landscapes, as when he visited the Mediterranean island of Mallorca. I'm going to quote briefly from this part of Rocinante because I think it's very revealing about what I'm saying. "We sat looking at the sea that was violet, where the sails of the homecoming fishing boats were the warm yellow of primroses. Behind us, the hills were sharp pirates blue. From a window in the adobe hut at one side of us came a smell of sizzling olive oil and tomatoes and peppers and the muffled sound of eggs being beaten. We were footsore, hungry, and we talked about women and love." Let me show you one more image. This is probably one of my favorite ones. It's a wonderful watercolor of the island of Mallorca. Here we see the cathedral on top of a hill. I think it's a wonderful image of Mallorca. very poetic as well. In Rocinante, Telemachus, the wandering character, becomes an observer who merges with the landscape and its people. In this process, he learns through the sensorial perceptions to encompass the enormous variety of sensory experiences he found in Spain. Thus, the nomadic character is always accompanied by Laius, who is a faithful counterpoint, a kind of ficelle, that inevitably reminds the reader of the special relationship Don Quixote and Sancho Panza developed through their long and adventurous journey. The mythical couple represents for Dos Passos the duality of the Spanish character. So Telemachus and Don Quixote symbolize intellectual life, a never-ending quest for adventure, and the need to embark on learning adventures, and Laius and Sancho Panza represent the body, the senses, and a hedonistic approach to life. In his quest for the Spanish gesture, Dos Passos was also intrigued by the word lo flamenco, which was in some way related to the Spanish folkloric world and the sensorial experience. In a long conversation with his fictional friend, Don Diego, the narrator insists on the meaning and cultural implications of the expression, in Spain we live from the belly and loins, or else from the head and heart. Between Don Quixote, the mystic, and Sancho Panza, the sensualist, there is no middle ground. The lowest panza is lo flamenco. And here we have a beautiful image of Pastora Imperio. I think that Dos Passos was fascinated by this dancer, by this Spanish dancer. And he mentions her many times in Rocinante. One of the most striking aspects of the mythical couple's journey is that it becomes a personal fictional narrative of Dos Passos' complex relationship with the powerful and successful image of his father, John Randolph Dos Passos. So his alter ego in this fictionalized travel book is Telemachus, no? By the way, John Dos Passos' father was a very successful Wall Street lawyer, and they had a difficult relationship. So in Rocinante, Dos Passos explores his childhood and adolescence as an immigrant, as a fatherless child who dreams about finding the roots of his origins. Telemachus had wandered so far in search of his father, he had quite forgotten what he was looking for. John Dos Passos was an illegitimate son. He was born in a hotel in Chicago. It seems that his father had a relationship with Lucy Sprague Madison, and he was married. So Dos Passos lived a kind of itinerant childhood in Europe and was born in a hotel. So it was a little bit he was announcing, this fact was announcing what his life was, in fact, no? He was an itinerant, a traveler all his life. So that's why I have said that he was a fatherless child who dreams about finding the roots of his origins. Telemachus had wandered so far in search of his father, he had quite forgotten what he was looking for. His successful father embodied the values of the American dream: material progress, social regeneration, and social mobility. However, Dos Passos soon detected the historical tensions of the American dream and its deep historical contradictions. In Spain, and from a distance, he was able to see the disturbing proximity of dream and nightmare and the effects of the loss of innocence in American society. As an expatriate in Spain, he discovered, quote, what he was prepared to find in an older and mainly unindustrialized culture, just as a few years afterwards, many American artists would find in Paris the freedom they believed lacking in America. Moreover, in Spain, he found his real self. Quote, I'm very happy walking about here in these zigzag empty streets. I have suddenly felt familiar with it all, as if it were part of me, as if I had soaked up some essence out of it. Similarly, he became the Adamic hero par excellence, separated from his culture in search of a reality more substantial than that embraced by the materialistic society he had rejected. And as I mentioned before, Don Quixote, the knight of the sorrowful countenance. who was one of Dos Passos' favorite characters, is incorporated as a mythical, powerful character in the travel book to create a modernist epic narrative based on his Edenic dreams and powerful experiences in Spain. Thus, the writer made a significant contribution to the modernist revival of the epic with the inclusion of the two most influential novels in the Western canon. Dos Passos' fictional alter ego, Telemachus, the son of Odysseus and Penelope, an observer, merges with the landscape and establishes a dialectical criticism between the Edenic Spain and the excesses of American society from a distance. Likewise, the old Spanish culture offered the American writer the opportunity to explore in depth the myth of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza in order to reevaluate the meanings of the wandering hero from La Mancha and his esquire, an aspect that was distinctive of high modernist poetics. Thus, Homer's Odyssey and Cervantes' Don Quixote serve as a literary map for Dos Passos. His reading of these classical epic narratives is that, quote, of a map of a whole complete and equally close region of the globe, as though somehow the very episodes themselves merged back into space, and the reading of them came to be indistinguishable from map reading, as Jameson has noted. Dos Passos found in the Spanish society of 1910s and 1920s the full spirit, the full life of spirit in which the natural, the honest, and the good still existed. He also discovered in his idealized image of Spain, quote, a space that resisted capitalism, centralized nationality, and the devastation of modern war, all of which he saw as ingrained in American culture, according to Rogers. For that reason, the fictional narrator's quest focused on what he described, again, as the Spanish gesture, embodied by two mythical individuals, the flamenco dancer Pastor Imperio and the baker from Almorrox in Toledo. That village of La Mancha becomes a metaphor, a sort of Arcadia, and a vehicle for the expression of his essential beliefs. Men lived in harmony with nature, fulfilled in body and soul. And this is the last part of my lecture, in which I explored the aspects of this transliterary dialogue that Dos Passos established with Spanish literature. In 1916, Dos Passos had spent most of the time in Madrid, which became his center of operations. It was the city that almost inspired his need for deepening in the Spanish gesture and in its lively streets and people. It was his adopted city, and as he confessed many times, the capital was a complete sensorial experience. Quote, honestly, I've never been in such a musical city as Madrid. Everything jingles and rings. I'm quite settled in Madrid now. I feel as if I'd lived here all my life. His cultural immersion underwent an unusual and intense adaptation to the customs and habits of the people of Madrid. Bautista, for instance, points out that Dos Passos felt fascinated by chocolate, the Sierra de Guadarrama, the botijos, which are jugs for water, donkeys and mules, multicolored shawls, and the hours Madrileños keep. Nevertheless, he was also aware of the inevitable transformation of modern life and how the Anglo-American influence was changing the city. Quote, at present in Madrid, even cafe life is receding before the exigencies of business and the hardly excusable mania for imitating English and American manners. Spain is undergoing great changes in its relation to the rest of Europe, to Latin America, in its own internal structure, end of quote. Dos Passos' main literary aspiration was to establish a transliterary dialogue with the most relevant Spanish writers. For this purpose, he got in contact with Juan Ramón Jiménez and other authors whose works he wanted to translate into English. When he met Jiménez, they had long conversations about Emily Dickinson, Emile Lowell, Robert Frost, and Walt Whitman, which Dos Passos knew very well. In the case of the Castilian poet Antonio Machado, Dos Passos attempted to imitate and made a poetic homage in Winter in Castile, which is the longest and more Spanish section of A Pushcart at the Curb. It goes without saying that Dos Passos might be considered a Hispanist, as he not only read Cervantes, but became familiar with the most important authors of the 98 generation. He saw Spanish literature as a diverse assemblage of styles and ideals rooted in the pre-industrial artisanship rather than factory reading commodification. In this sense, his readings of the most significant authors of the 98th generation gave him a direct vision of the political and historical crisis the Spanish writers were depicting in their work as a result of the War of 1898 that ended Spain's colonial empire in the Americas. In Rocinante, Dos Passos not only makes a complex fusion of literary criticism, translation, autobiography, fiction, propaganda, social historical commentary. He also attempts to establish a transatlantic dialogue between American and Spanish literature in his quest for the internationalization of the literary experience. Similarly, he encourages the American public to read Spanish literature in a very persuasive way, sorry. If the American public is bound to take up Spain, it might as well take up the worthwhile things instead of the works of popular vulgarization. They have enough of those in their bookcases, as it is. And in Spain, there are novelists like Baroja, essays like Unamuno and Azorín, poets like Valle Inclán and Antonio Machado. But I suppose they will shine with the reflected glory of the author of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which was really popular in that time, Blasco Ibáñez, the Valencian writer Blasco Ibáñez. In section 16, Dos Passos also pays a tribute to Miguel de Unamuno, one of the leading intellectuals of the period who has been condemned to 15 years imprisonment for an offense committed against the dignity of the reigning sovereign Alfonso XIII. With this reference, the narrator makes a statement about the right for freedom of opinion and expression that should prevail in any modern society like Spain. In the same way, Dos Passos shows his ideological proximity to the Spanish writer when he stresses Unamuno's resistance to the materialistic modernization and Europeanization of Spanish life and thought. The philosopher believed that Spanish society had to endorse the democratic political principles in order to be like other European societies. Furthermore, Dos Passos praises the philosopher's views on the chasm between faith and reason and the transcendental significance of each individual in essays such as The Tragic Feeling of Life, Del Sentimiento Trágico de la Vida. Certainly, this is one of Unamuno's most influential essays, and Dos Passos stresses its significance when he quotes a long paragraph on Don Quixote's idealism and the hero's importance in Spanish society. Quote, "What is then the new mission of Don Quixote in this world? To cry in the wilderness, for the wilderness hears although men do not hear, and one day will turn into a sonorous wood, and the solitary voice that spreads in the desert like seed will sprout into a giant cedar." In his transnational quest for the Spanish gesture and for the return to a mythic Arcadia, Dos Passos was searching for a way to define his own unstable hybrid modernist identity and establish a dialectical interaction between his artistic subjectivity and his idealization of a new country. Thus, his journey in Spain was not similar to that of the American 19th century conventional travelers or tourists. Rather, his way of traveling and visiting Spain was based on his curiosity and preference for knowing the language, the literature, the food, the politics, and above all, the idiosyncrasy of the peculiarities of Spanish culture. In this way, Rocinante embodies Dos Passos' cosmopolitan modernist quest to internationalize literature, often making powerful connections between his literature and a broad range of literary myths, finding a more meaningful modern culture. His temporary expatriate condition in Spain and the reality of being a young American with Portuguese roots determined in some way his need for a more Edenic and epic culture from the limitations of the excesses of American urban industrialization and cultural materialism. Therefore, we might conclude that Spain became the country that inspired his rebellious spirit and innovative writing in an early period in which he clearly devoted himself to radical politics and experimental modernism to construct a cosmopolitan subjectivity. For this purpose, he makes intertextual allusions to the classical epic narratives, the Odyssey and Don Quixote, from a modernist perspective. And related to this, I think it is very important to highlight that epic narratives in general focus on a crisis in the history of a race or culture. And they're always concerned with crossing cultural frontiers. I think that in many ways, Dos Passos was pointing out the crisis in which American civilization was immersed and how it had to be explored by crossing literary frontiers, incorporating the deeds of epic warriors and heroes from other cultural contexts. This is how other modernist writers, T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland, Gertrude Stein in The Making of the Americans, and Ezra Pound in the Cantos, chief among them, approached the epic conventions in their literature. In other words, the modernist creativity was based on the crossing of cultural and ideological frontiers. Then for Dos Passos, the epic journey becomes a cross-cultural experience to learn a lesson, change, and later return home after he had achieved self-knowledge, transformation, and the exploration of new cultures and ways of life. He was restless for travel all his life and believed in traveling as a personal experience of discovering and learning. But his deep sense of social rooting and displacement had also a significant role in his urgent need for having the perspective of another land. Moreover, he appreciated solitude, independence, and the personal enrichment he found in the exploration of diverse cultures and in the opportunity of looking at his own with a certain distance and without prejudices on attachments, aiming to act as an objective chronicler of the times he witnessed. As a result, his journeys in many different countries all over the world became for the writer transcendental processes of personal metamorphosis, which provided a great opportunity for exploring his adventurous spirit and never-ending curiosity. As Donald Pizer has cleverly noted, quote, he sought in his depiction of a foreign culture to explore in striking new forms the meaning of his own, end of quote. And finally, I would like to show you and conclude with an image of Dos Passos cafeteria in Madrid, in case you want to have a walk around downtown Madrid. This cafeteria is on San Bernardo Street 42, and it reminds Madrileños and visitors the presence of the American writer in the city. Dos Passos walked all over the neighborhood and became good friends of the original owner of this cafeteria, which is famous for its tapas of Spanish omelette. So it seems that he enjoyed them very much. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Eulalia Piñero, for a wonderful, wonderful keynote lecture. I will open the floor to some questions, very brief questions, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, but I just want to highlight how timely this lecture has been. Not only, because we are in Spain, I think it's a good opportunity to explore the connections between American writers and Spain. We all know about Hemingway's connections and many novels, located in Spain and inspired by Spain. We also know about Washington Irving, his wonderful works about Granada and the Alhambra and everything else. And now Lali has presented us with John Dos Passos' love for Spain, the inspiration that he found in Spain, almost as a Hispanist, we could say, as she said. John Dos Passos is very well known for his, USA trilogy and for Manhattan Transfer, but I think the works that Lali has translated and has presented brilliantly to us today are absolutely timely, since, Rocinante, To the Road Again, and A Pushcart at the Curb were published in 1922. Moreover, Lali, she has, highlighted passages in John Dos Passos' work in which he talks about the war. We are in the middle of a horrible war in Europe today. He has, spoken about a pandemic, the wrongly cold Spanish flu of 1918. So I think everything that has been presented today by Professor Piñero everything is absolutely timely. And once again, we understand how works written over 100 years ago are still absolutely up to date, applicable to our present days, to our present, wasteland in some ways, but also to our present Spain. So again, we understand how literature teaches us about us in its always universal and timelessness spirit. So thank you, Eulalia, for a wonderful talk. We have some minutes because there's a coffee break now. Yeah.
Thank you, Isabel.
Yes. So here we have one, Carolina. I don't know if there's a microphone around. Yeah, maybe.
Well, hello. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Piñero, Lali, for this extremely knowledgeable talk. Thank you to the organizers also. I think it was a great decision to appoint Lali as the keynote speaker, because you have infused us with the necessary energy to go through the rest of the conference. My question is a very obvious one, I guess, for a Spaniard, since you've mentioned this transliterary dialogue between the Passos and Spanish writers. So my question is, could you please expand a little bit upon this transliterary dialogue between Winter in Castile and Campos de Castilla? Thank you.
You mean Machado's Campos? Yes, this is interesting because this, in a similar lecture I delivered in November at the WOM, I also mentioned that Dos Passos had an impressive admiration for Machado. In fact, his method for learning Spanish was to carry all over the place a copy of Machado's Campos de Castilla, and he said that he learned Spanish from that wonderful book. Well, the influence is evident in Winter in Castile, especially in, of course, he incorporates all the imaginism of the modernist poetics, but he is imitating in many ways when he describes the fields and the landscape of Castilla-La Mancha and Castilla-León. He imitates certain techniques of Machado's description. So yes, there is a kind of imitation which is, in my view, an homage to Machado. Thank you, Carolina.
So one last question, because we have to, get away from here. Roberta, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I just want to make one statement, because it seems we can re-experience these feelings of disillusionment and loss of innocence in our own about his perception of Spain. And we know, of course, the following of the dictatorship with Franco that happened in Spain. So we can feel that tension without even having to address it. And I wondered, I would like to hear your thoughts on what I was thinking about when you were setting up this binary, the intellect and spirit with Don Quixote, and the body and senses with Panza. Because it seems to me that Dos Passos in Manhattan Transfer, it's not just this binary of the good and bad, but actually he improves Manhattan Transfer with this body that is central. The city, the metropolis, actually takes perhaps on something of the idyllic Spain, the rural Spain, in a different way in this metropolis. And I wonder whether you think that perhaps Dos Passos managed to merge these binaries, if we perhaps read it in a different way, that suddenly also the metropolis, the US sort of wasteland, suddenly also became central and has sort of something more than just loss and despair. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yes, it's really relevant. I mean, when we read John Dos Passos' early writings, his poetry book and Rocinante, and then we advance into reading Three Soldiers and Manhattan Transfer that you have just quoted, we see his evolution, but we feel the same despair and disillusion in Manhattan Transfer. Jimmy Herf ends up leaving New York because New York is a kind of wasteland. He cannot live there. It is a very competitive society. It's a dehumanized society. It's a society that only cares about money. In fact, many times he mentioned that Manhattan and New York in general is not a city for the people. And that's why he eventually leaves Manhattan, New York. So yes, I think that in most of John Dos Passos' heroes, in this case, John Andrews, his alter ego in Three Soldiers, and Jimmy Herf in Manhattan Transfer, there is always an ever-present idealism, a quest for a more spiritual life, beyond all the materialistic constraints of American society. Nevertheless, I must say that that doesn't happen in USA in the trilogy, but in his last works, there is a kind of reconciliation between Dos Passos and American society. But in this aspect that I have just mentioned, Spain is again related because in 1937, he came as a war correspondent to Madrid. And by the way, he lived together with, shared a hotel room with Ernest Hemingway. And when his friend Jose Robles Passos, the translator of Manhattan Transfer into Spanish, was murdered by the Soviet secret services, that became a kind of turning point in his life. He was an idealist socialist. He believed in socialism in its purest sense, but that fact changed his life for good, and he became very critical about, the Soviet Union and other and socialist countries. Again, Spain was present in John Dos Passos' life and vital experience. Thank you.
So I'm afraid we have to stop now. There's a 5-minute break for us. Thank you for being here. Please join me again in thanking Lali for this wonderful, wonderful talk.
Thank you, Isabel.